bronze spear trembled in his grip as King Leonidas gazed across the battlefield at Thermopylae. But the weapon wasn't shaking from fear. It was vibrating with anticipation for the slaughter that was about to begin. History has painted this Spartan king as the ultimate hero, the noble warrior who died defending Greece against impossible odds. But what if everything you thought you knew about Leonidas was a carefully constructed lie? What if the man who became legend was actually one of the most ruthless monsters ever to wear a crown? Behind the gleaming bronze armor and heroic speeches lay a man whose path to power was paved with betrayal, whose family tree was so twisted it would make modern soap operas look tame, and whose personal life harbored secrets so dark they would shock even the bloodthirsty Spartans themselves. The real story of Leonidas isn't just about 300 warriors making a last stand. It's about a king who clawed his way to the throne through manipulation, violence, and acts so morally reprehensible that they've been whitewashed from popular history for over 2,000 years. Today we're tearing away the myth to expose the monster beneath. By the time we're finished, you'll understand why the Persians weren't the only ones who should have feared this man, and why his own people might have had more reason to tremble in his presence than any foreign enemy ever did. This isn't the sanitized version of Leonidas you've seen in movies or read in school textbooks. This is the unvarnished truth about a ruler whose cruelty knew no bounds, and whose legacy was built on a foundation of blood, betrayal, and unthinkable depravity. The story begins not with heroic battles or noble sacrifices, but in the shadowy corridors of Spartan politics, where power was won through cunning and held through terror. To understand the monster that Leonidas became, we need to examine the twisted family dynamics that shaped him from birth. The Spartan royal house wasn't just dysfunctional, it was a breeding ground for the kind of moral corruption that would define Leonidas's entire reign. His father, King Anaxandridas, had already established a pattern of moral flexibility that would serve as a template for his son's later actions. When political pressure mounted for him to produce an heir, Anaxandridas made a decision that revealed the calculating nature that ran in the royal bloodline. Rather than divorcing his beloved first wife, he chose to take a second wife while remaining married to the first. This wasn't an act of love or loyalty, it was pure political maneuvering, designed to satisfy the demands of Sparta's ruling elite while maintaining his personal preferences. The consequences of this decision would ripple through generations, creating a web of rivalry and resentment that would ultimately require bloodshed to resolve. When Anaxandridas finally died, the stage was set for a succession crisis that would reveal just how far the royal family was willing to go to secure power. The eldest son, Cleomenes, claimed the throne, but his half-brother Dorius refused to accept this outcome. The bitterness between these brothers wasn't just political disagreement. It was the kind of deep-seated hatred that could only be resolved through violence or exile. Dorius chose exile, but even that wasn't enough to satisfy the cruel appetites of fate. His attempts to establish colonies in Africa and Sicily both ended in failure and death, clearing one obstacle from Leonidas's path to power. But the most disturbing part of this family drama wasn't the political maneuvering or even the violent deaths. It was the way these events shaped the young Leonidas, teaching him that family bonds meant nothing when power was at stake, and that survival required a willingness to sacrifice anyone who stood in your way. Unlike his brothers who were born as potential heirs, Leonidas spent his formative years subjected to the brutal training regimen known as the agoge. This wasn't just military education, it was systematic dehumanization designed to strip away every trace of mercy, compassion, or moral restraint. Boys were starved, beaten, and forced to fight each other for scraps of food. They were taught to steal, lie, and kill without hesitation. Most importantly, they learned that strength was the only virtue that mattered, and that weakness in any form deserved only contempt and destruction. The agoge didn't just create soldiers, it manufactured monsters. And Leonidas wasn't just any graduate of this system, he was one of its most successful products. By the time he reached adulthood, He had internalized every lesson the Spartan system had to offer. He understood that power belonged to those willing to take it by any means necessary, that loyalty was a luxury that kings couldn't afford, and that the only difference between a hero and a villain was who controlled the narrative. When his brother Cleomenes began showing signs of mental instability, Leonidas saw opportunity where others might have seen tragedy. Rather than supporting his brother or seeking help for his condition, Leonidas positioned himself to benefit from Cleomenes' downfall. The exact details of what happened next have been sanitized by historians who preferred their heroes untainted by ugly realities, but the outcome speaks for itself. Cleomenes ended up imprisoned by his own family and died under mysterious circumstances that cleared the final obstacle from Leonidas' path to absolute power. This wasn't a reluctant king accepting a burden thrust upon him by circumstances. This was a calculating predator who had spent years positioning himself to seize control of one of the most powerful military states in the ancient world. The moment Leonidas claimed the throne, Sparta gained a ruler whose capacity for cruelty would exceed even their brutal standards. His famous response to critics who questioned his superiority reveals the arrogance and contempt that would characterize his entire reign. When challenged about what made him better than ordinary citizens, Leonidas didn't appeal to divine right or noble birth. Instead, he simply stated that if he weren't superior, he wouldn't be king. This circular logic perfectly encapsulates the mindset of a tyrant who believed that power itself was proof of worthiness. In Leonidas' worldview, might made right, and anyone who couldn't seize power for themselves deserved whatever fate their betters chose to impose. This philosophy would guide every decision he made as king, from his treatment of political rivals to his conduct in warfare to the most disturbing aspects of his personal life that we'll explore in the coming segments. The transformation of Leonidas from royal prince to monster king was complete by the time he ascended to power, but his reign would prove that even Spartan standards of brutality could be exceeded by a ruler with sufficient imagination and complete absence of moral restraint. What happened next would make his family's twisted history look like a gentle fairy tale in comparison. The first taste of absolute power came when Leonidas decided to deal with the remaining threats to his rule. Unlike the sanitized accounts that paint him as a reluctant leader thrust into kingship by tragic circumstances, the truth reveals a man who systematically eliminated anyone who might challenge his authority. The methods he employed weren't just brutal by modern standards, they were considered extreme, even by the blood-soaked norms of ancient Sparta. Within months of claiming the throne, several prominent Spartan nobles who had supported his brother Dorieus began disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Official records blamed accidents, hunting mishaps, and sudden illnesses, but palace servants whispered of midnight visits from the king's personal guards and bodies that were never found. Leonidas had learned from his father's political maneuvering that sometimes the most effective solution was the permanent one, but physical elimination of rivals was only the beginning. Leonidas understood that true power required not just the removal of enemies, but the complete terror of potential opposition. He instituted a reign of psychological warfare against his own nobles that would make Machiavelli himself take notes. Dinner invitations to the royal palace became death sentences that nobody could refuse. Guests would arrive expecting lavish feasts and political discussions, only to witness public executions of supposed traitors whose only crime was expressing the mildest criticism of royal policy. The king took particular pleasure in forcing noble families to participate in these spectacles. Parents were compelled to watch as their children were tortured for imaginary crimes, while wives were made to choose between their husbands' lives and their own. Those who survived these ordeals were broken psychologically, transformed into hollow shells who would never again dare to question royal authority. The message was clear. In Leonidas' Sparta, even the appearance of disloyalty would would result in consequences worse than death. What made these purges particularly disturbing was the systematic way Leonidas went about destroying entire bloodlines that might pose future threats. He didn't just execute potential rivals, he eliminated their children, their relatives who might carry, and anyone their legacy forward. Spartan law traditionally protected the families of executed criminals, but Leonidas rewrote those protections to ensure that his enemies would be erased not just from life, but from history itself. The king's paranoia extended beyond political threats to encompass anyone who might possess information about his rise to power. Servants who had witnessed suspicious events during Cleomenes's final days began suffering fatal accidents with alarming frequency. Guards who had been present during key moments of the succession found themselves reassigned to suicidal military missions on distant frontiers. Even court physicians who had treated the royal family were quietly disposed of to prevent any inconvenient testimonies about the circumstances surrounding the previous king's death. This systematic elimination of witnesses reveals a level of calculated cruelty that goes far beyond simple political necessity. Leonidas wasn't just securing his throne, he was rewriting history itself to ensure that future generations would never learn the truth about how he had seized power. The hero king of popular imagination was actually a master manipulator who understood that controlling the narrative was just as important as controlling the army. The domestic policies implemented during his reign reflected this same combination of strategic thinking and sadistic pleasure. Leonidas expanded the already brutal helot slave system, but with innovations that pushed suffering to new human extremes. Traditional Spartan practice involved periodic cullings of the slave population to prevent rebellions, but these killings had typically been swift and efficient. Under Leonidas, they became elaborate public tortures designed to terrorize the surviving slaves into absolute submission. The king personally oversaw these spectacles, taking visible pleasure in the creative methods his executioners employed. Slaves weren't just killed, they were slowly dismembered while still alive, their screams serving as entertainment for Spartan citizens who were required to attend these events. Families were forced to watch as their members were tortured to death, creating psychological trauma that would be passed down through generations of survivors. Even more disturbing was Leonidas's practice of using these executions as teaching tools for young Spartan boys. Children as young as 7 were brought to witness the torture sessions, with the king personally explaining the techniques being used and the reasons why such cruelty was necessary. This wasn't just about maintaining social order, it was about systematically destroying the capacity for empathy in future generations of Spartan leaders. The economic policies of his reign reflected the same callous disregard for human suffering. While Sparta had always been a militaristic society that relied on slave labor, Leonidas pushed extremes. He systemed to unprecedented this instituted quotas that required each helot family to produce specific amounts of food and goods, with failure to meet these targets resulting in the execution of random family members. This created a climate of constant terror where even the most productive slaves lived in fear of arbitrary punishment. The king also established a network of informants among the slave population, promising freedom to those who reported on their fellow helots. This destroyed any possibility of solidarity among the oppressed and ensured that potential rebellions would be discovered before they could develop. But Leonidas rarely honored his promises of freedom, instead using the information to identify and eliminate the most intelligent and capable slaves who might pose future threats. Perhaps most revealing of his character was the way Leonidas treated the families of Spartan soldiers who died in his service. Traditional Spartan custom honored the widows and orphans of fallen warriors, providing them with financial support and social protection. But under Leonidas, these families became tools for political control. Widows who showed insufficient enthusiasm for his policies found their support withdrawn, while their children were taken away and given to more loyal families. The king used the grief of bereaved families as leverage to ensure absolute obedience from his military commanders. Officers knew that any sign of disloyalty wouldn't just result in their own deaths, but in the systematic destruction of everyone they cared about. This created a military hierarchy based not on honor or patriotism, but on terror and the knowledge that failure to serve the king's interests would result in consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. The religious institutions of Sparta weren't immune to his manipulations either. Leonidas understood that controlling the priests meant controlling the interpretation of divine will, so he systematically replaced traditional religious leaders with individuals owed their positions entirely to royal favor. These puppet priests delivered sermons that portrayed the king as divinely chosen, and any opposition to his rule as blasphemy against the gods themselves. When traditional oracles delivered prophecies that didn't align with his political objectives, Leonidas had them declared false, and their speakers executed for spreading lies about divine will. He established new oracles staffed by individuals who understood that their survival depended on delivering messages that supported royal policy. This transformation of religion into a tool of state control demonstrated a level of cynical manipulation that would have impressed the most corrupt tyrants of any era. The corruption extended into every aspect of Spartan society under his rule. Justice became a commodity that could be purchased by those with sufficient wealth or connections, while the poor found themselves subject to increasingly arbitrary and cruel punishments for minor offenses. The traditional Spartan virtues of honor, courage, and sacrifice were perverted into justifications for whatever actions served the king's interests, regardless of their moral implications. The systematic destruction of Spartan moral foundations under Leonidas's rule created a society where the most depraved acts were not only tolerated, but actively encouraged. The king's personal example set the standard for acceptable behavior, and that standard plunged to depths that would horrify even the most hardened observers of ancient cruelty. What emerged was a culture where sadism became virtue and where the capacity for inflicting suffering was seen as the highest mark of leadership potential. The transformation was most visible in how the king conducted his personal relationships. Marriage in Spartan society had traditionally been a political alliance combined with genuine partnership. But Leonidas perverted even this basic human institution into something grotesque. His choice of bride revealed depths of moral corruption that shocked even his contemporaries, who thought they had witnessed every possible form of royal depravity. When the time came for the king to secure his dynasty through marriage, he looked not to foreign princesses or noble daughters from allied cities, but to his own family tree. The woman he chose as his queen was Gorgo, but she wasn't just any eligible maiden from Spartan nobility. She was his own niece, the daughter of his deceased brother Cleomenes. This wasn't a marriage born of political necessity or even twisted passion. It was a calculated act designed to consolidate power, while simultaneously humiliating the memory of his brother and asserting dominance over his brother's legacy. The wedding ceremony itself became a spectacle of deliberate sacrilege. Traditional Spartan marriage rites emphasized the joining of two separate bloodlines and the creation of new family bonds. But Leonidas transformed the ritual into a celebration of his complete control over his brother's former household. He forced the bride's mother, his own sister-in-law, to participate in ceremonies that made her complicit in what amounted to the final desecration of her husband's memory. But the true horror wasn't just the incestuous nature of the union. It was the way Leonidas used his marriage as a weapon against anyone who had ever shown loyalty to Cleomenes. Former supporters of his brother were compelled to attend the wedding and publicly celebrate a union that represented everything their dead king had stood against. Those who showed insufficient enthusiasm found themselves facing charges of treason, while their families were subjected to punishments that made death seem merciful by comparison. The queen herself became both victim and accomplice in her husband's reign of terror. Historical accounts suggest that Gorgo possessed intelligence and political acumen that might have made her a formidable ruler in her own right. But under Leonidas's control, these qualities were twisted into instruments of oppression. She became his primary agent for destroying the women of noble families who posed potential threats to royal authority. The methods employed were particularly insidious because they exploited the traditional bonds of female friendship and support that had helped Spartan women navigate their harsh society. Gorgo would befriend the wives and daughters of suspected dissidents, drawing them into intimate conversations where they might reveal their true thoughts about royal policies. These confidences were then used as evidence in show trials that resulted in public executions designed to terrorize other noble women into absolute silence. The king's domestic life became a laboratory for developing new techniques of psychological torture that could then be applied to political enemies. Palace servants reported witnessing scenes that defied comprehension, where the royal couple would stage elaborate dinners for noble families, only to reveal that the meat being served came from their own executed relatives. The guests were forced to consume these meals while expressing gratitude for royal hospitality, knowing that any sign of revulsion would result in their own immediate death. These dinner parties weren't isolated incidents of sadistic entertainment. They were carefully orchestrated psychological operations designed to break the spirits of Sparta's ruling class completely. Attendees left these events fundamentally changed, their capacity for resistance shattered by experiences that challenged their basic understanding of human decency. The king understood that people who had been forced to participate in such horrors would never again possess the moral authority to challenge his rule. The corruption of traditional Spartan values extended into the military sphere as well, where Leonidas transformed the legendary warrior culture into something that bore little resemblance to its heroic reputation. The famous Spartan emphasis on honor in battle was perverted into justification for war crimes that violated every accepted standard of civilized warfare. Prisoners weren't just executed, they were subjected to elaborate tortures that served no military purpose beyond satisfying the king's appetite for cruelty. The treatment of defeated enemies became a test of loyalty for Spartan officers. Those who showed any hesitation in carrying out increasingly barbaric orders found themselves accused of weakness and subjected to the same tortures they had refused to inflict. This created a military hierarchy where advancement required not just tactical skill or personal courage, but a willingness to abandon every trace of human decency in service to royal demands. The king took personal pleasure in designing new forms of battlefield cruelty that would maximize both physical suffering and psychological terror. Enemy soldiers weren't just killed in combat, they were captured alive whenever possible so they could be subjected to public tortures that would demoralize their comrades and demonstrate Spartan power. These spectacles became elaborate productions where Leonidas would personally demonstrate torture techniques to his officers while explaining the strategic benefits of extreme cruelty. The impact on Spartan military culture was profound and lasting. Warriors who had once prided themselves on clean kills and honorable combat found themselves competing to devise increasingly creative methods of inflicting suffering. The legendary Spartan discipline was redirected toward perfecting techniques of torture rather than developing tactical excellence. Victory in battle became less important than the demonstration of absolute ruthlessness toward defeated enemies. The king's appetite for cruelty wasn't limited to foreign enemies or political rivals within Sparta itself. He turned his attention to the broader Greek world, using diplomatic missions as opportunities to spread terror throughout the region. Ambassadors from other city-states who came to negotiate with Sparta found themselves subjected to treatment that violated every accepted standard of diplomatic immunity and international law. These diplomatic encounters became showcases for Leonidas's creativity in developing new forms of psychological warfare. Foreign envoys would arrive expecting traditional negotiations conducted according to established protocols, only to find themselves trapped in elaborate games where their survival depended on their willingness to participate in increasingly degrading acts. Those who refused were subjected to tortures that were designed to be visible to their home cities, sending clear messages about the consequences of opposing Spartan interests. The king understood that reputation could be as powerful as military force in achieving his objectives. By creating a legend of absolute ruthlessness that extended far beyond Sparta's borders, he could often achieve his goals through intimidation rather than actual warfare. Enemy cities would surrender without fighting rather than risk the consequences of resistance, while potential allies rushed to demonstrate their loyalty through increasingly desperate gestures of submission. This reign of terror reached its peak in the years leading up to the Persian invasion, when Leonidas's paranoia and sadism combined to create a perfect storm of domestic oppression. The king became convinced that the approaching Persian threat provided the perfect cover for eliminating any remaining sources of internal opposition. He launched a final purge that exceeded even his previous standards of brutality, targeting not just political enemies, but anyone who possessed knowledge about his rise to power or his methods of maintaining control. The preparations for war became an excuse for implementing martial law that gave the king unlimited authority to dispose of anyone he deemed a threat. Noble families that had survived previous purges found themselves facing extinction as Leonidas moved to eliminate every possible source of future challenge to his authority. The irony was devastating. In preparing to defend Sparta against foreign invasion, the king was systematically destroying the very people who had made Spartan civilization worth defending. The final months before Thermopylae witnessed atrocities that surpassed even the worst excesses of Leonidas's previous reign. The king seemed determined to ensure that if he died in battle against the Persians, he would leave behind a legacy of terror so complete that no one would dare challenge the succession of his chosen heir. What followed would make his previous cruelties seem almost restrained by comparison. As the Monster King prepared for his final performance on history's stage, the madness that consumed Leonidas in those final months before the Persian invasion reached levels that defied human comprehension. Palace servants who had witnessed years of royal brutality found themselves unprepared for the escalating horrors that now filled their daily existence. The king's chambers became laboratories of suffering, where screams echoed through stone corridors at all hours, creating an atmosphere so thick with terror that even hardened Spartan warriors crossed themselves when passing the royal quarters. What drove this final descent into absolute depravity wasn't fear of the approaching Persian army, but something far more disturbing. Leonidas had received reports that Xerxes commanded forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and rather than feeling intimidated, he experienced a perverse excitement at the prospect of matching his cruelty against that of the Persian king. This wasn't preparation for noble sacrifice. It was the anticipation of a sadist who finally had an opponent worthy of his twisted imagination. The Helot population bore the brunt of this escalating violence, as Leonidas used them as test subjects for techniques he planned to employ against Persian prisoners. Entire slave families were subjected to experimental tortures designed to determine how much pain the human body could endure before death provided merciful release. The king personally oversaw these sessions, taking detailed notes on which methods produced the most prolonged suffering and the greatest psychological impact on witnesses. But the slaves weren't his only victims during this period of intensified brutality. Leonidas turned his attention to the Spartan citizens themselves, implementing policies that revealed his complete contempt for the people he was supposedly preparing to defend. Families suspected of insufficient loyalty were subjected to loyalty tests that involved forcing parents to choose which of their children would be executed as proof of their devotion to the crown. Those who hesitated faced the execution of all their offspring, while those who complied quickly enough earned the privilege of watching their chosen child die slowly. These tests weren't random acts of cruelty. They were calculated exercises in social engineering designed to identify which families possessed the absolute obedience necessary for his vision of Spartan society. The king understood that the Persian invasion provided a unique opportunity to reshape his kingdom completely, eliminating not just external threats, but internal elements that failed to meet his standards of perfect submission. Victory or defeat against Xerxes mattered less than ensuring that whoever survived would be utterly incapable of challenging royal authority. The religious establishment found itself particularly targeted during this period, as Leonidas moved to eliminate any source of moral authority that might compete with his own. Priests who had served faithfully for decades discovered that their traditional protections meant nothing when confronted with a king who recognized no law beyond his own will. Sacred temples became sites of deliberate sacrilege, where religious ceremonies were perverted into displays of royal power that mocked every belief the Spartans held dear. The oracle at Delphi had delivered her prophecy about Leonidas's fate, predicting that either Sparta would fall or a king would die. Rather than accepting this divine judgment with traditional Spartan stoicism, Leonidas responded with characteristic arrogance and cruelty. He ordered the execution of every priest in Sparta who had communicated the oracle's words, claiming they were spreading defeatist propaganda designed to weaken morale before the crucial battle. The replacement priests installed by royal command delivered very laming that the different messages, gods, had chosen Leonidas as their instrument for destroying the Persian invasion and establishing Spartan dominance over all of Greece. These fabricated prophecies served the political needs, King's immediate, but they also revealed his fundamental contempt for the religious beliefs that had sustained Spartan society for generations. In Leonidas's worldview, even the gods existed merely to serve his personal ambitions. The final weeks before departing for Thermopylae witnessed the complete breakdown of traditional Spartan social structures under the weight of royal terror. Noble families that had proudly traced their lineages back centuries found themselves reduced to cowering shadows, terrified to speak or act without explicit royal permission. The legendary Spartan courage that had made them famous ancient world was systematic throughout the crushed by a king who understood that brave men might eventually find the strength to resist his rule. The selection process for the 300 warriors who would accompany Leonidas to Thermopylae wasn't based on military merit or heroic virtue, as popular accounts suggest. Instead, it was a carefully calculated political purge disguised as honor guard selection. The king chose men whose deaths would eliminate potential threats to his dynasty, while simultaneously removing witnesses to his most heinous crimes. Each selected warrior represented either a political rival, a moral conscience that might challenge royal policies, or simply someone who knew too much about how Leonidas had secured his throne. The families of these chosen men understood exactly what their selection meant, but they were powerless to protest without condemning their loved ones to far worse fates than honorable death in battle. The king made it clear that any family showing insufficient enthusiasm for their members' selection would face consequences that would make the warrior's death seem merciful by comparison. This created the grotesque spectacle of grieving relatives publicly celebrating appointments they knew were death sentences. The departure ceremony for Thermopylae became Leonidas's final masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Rather than the solemn military procession depicted in popular imagination, it was a carefully orchestrated display of royal power designed to terrorize the population into absolute submission during the king's absence. The 300 warriors marched, not as heroes going to defend their homeland, but as broken men who understood they were being sacrificed to satisfy their ruler's political convenience. The king's final address to his people before departure revealed the complete corruption of traditional Spartan values under his rule. Instead of speaking about honor, sacrifice, and duty to the state, Leonidas delivered a speech that was essentially a catalogue of threats against anyone who might consider challenging royal authority during his absence. He promised that his agents remaining in Sparta would continue monitoring the population for signs of disloyalty, and that punishment for treason would extend to the 7th generation of any family foolish enough to oppose the crown. Queen Gorgo's role in maintaining this reign of terror during her husband's absence was carefully planned and meticulously executed. She wasn't just a figurehead preserving royal dignity, she was an active participant in the systematic oppression that had become the defining characteristic of Leonidas's reign. The king had trained her personally in techniques of psychological manipulation and physical torture, ensuring that his policies would continue unchanged, even if he never returned from battle. The queen's first act after her husband's departure was to implement a series of loyalty purges that exceeded even Leonidas's previous standards of brutality. Noble families were required to demonstrate their continuing devotion to the crown through increasingly elaborate displays of submission that involved the systematic humiliation and destruction of their own members. Those who complied found themselves trapped in cycles of degradation that destroyed their capacity for resistance, while those who refused faced immediate extinction. So there you have it, the truth about Leonidas that history tried to bury beneath layers of heroic myth and Bronze Age propaganda. The man who stood at Thermopylae wasn't the noble defender of freedom we've been taught to revere, but a monster whose cruelty exceeded even the brutal standards of ancient Sparta. His 300 warriors weren't heroes marching to glorious death. They were victims of a calculated purge, sacrificed to eliminate political threats, while their king played his final twisted game of power. The next time you see that iconic image of the Spartan king with his spear raised against the Persian horde, remember what we've uncovered today. Sometimes the greatest monsters in history are the ones we've been conditioned to call heroes. The real Leonidas died as he lived, not in service to his people, but as the architect of their suffering, leaving behind a legacy written in blood and terror that no amount of Hollywood glamour can ever truly wash clean.